Aloha, inspired moneymakers. Welcome to Inspired Money, where we explore money stories to make more, give more, and live more. Today, I want to start with a confession. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with technology. I love living in a time where I can drive to Brooklyn or Hoboken without wasting my time because I'm not hopelessly lost. I'm also grateful that AI can help me to edit video clips, but it's easy to get caught up in the digital whirlwind at the expense of being truly present with our loved ones, our family and friends. I'm sure that many of you can relate. Me telling our kids to tear themselves away from TikTok or Roblox and go play outside. This is a modern day struggle. Or I'm guilty myself of mindlessly scrolling and losing an hour of my day. Today's episode is our Masterclass series on advanced watch collecting. There's something timeless, something almost rebellious about a wristwatch. It's a celebration of human ingenuity, a symbol of craftsmanship in our increasingly digital world. And you can express yourself by what you choose to wear on your wrist. And who knows, if the dreaded Judgment Day ever arrives, Terminator style, maybe Patek Philippe will become the ultimate emblem of the resistance, proof that humanity's spirit can't be snuffed out by a cybernetic apocalypse. So let's embark on a journey together. Over the next hour, you and I, along with our esteemed panelists, will explore the intricacies of watch complications to unraveling the mysteries of limited editions and collaborations. We're going to talk about the prestige of brand heritage and uncover the art of verifying luxury timepieces. Before we bring in our guests, I just want to point you to two Inspired Money lives that we had last month. We did Unlocking the Secrets of Successful Retirement with grandmapreneur Connie Inokai, Professor Ross Andel, an expert in the field of cognitive aging and dementia research, and Jamie Hopkins, a professor at the American College of Financial Services. The other follow-up show was Effective Retirement Income Strategies, Securing Your Financial Future. We had retirement researcher Wade Pfau, Vanguard's Colleen Giaconetti, head of retirement research David Blanchett, and personal finance author Emily Guy Birkin. The discussions were all great. If you haven't watched yet, check those episodes out. As a longtime financial advisor, I'll tell you that a little planning can go a long way. And the earlier that you start, the better. I have a link for you if you're interested in doing a 3-minute plan that calculates your max retirement income. You can go to inspiredmoney.fm/getplan. That's GETPLAN. Let's welcome in our panelists. It'll be interesting because we may be down from 4 planned panelists to 2, but we're going to have a party either way. First, we've got Christian Zeron. He's creative director as well as partner at LMF NYC, Consulting and Creative. He's responsible for overseeing all aspects of brand ideation, strategy, and creative development. A passionate speaker, historian, and thought leader in the luxury watch industry, Christian started his career at Theo and Harris, an entertainment and education outlet in the space, which is watched for over 2 million minutes per month. Christian, welcome to Inspired Money.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I'm looking forward to talking about watches today. I love the way you set it up, right? That watches, even today, are, and maybe one day will even be larger, a symbol of the resistance, right? The resistance to technology. I like that very much, and I agree with you. So looking forward to it.
I hope that we don't see Terminator Judgment Day. If I do, I hope that I'll have a really nice wristwatch to fight the robots with. And then coming in from his vacation, we have Tony Traina, an editor at Hodinkee, the leading digital publication about watches. He specializes in covering collectibles and vintage watches. Before joining Hodinkee, he started his own newsletter, Rescapement, all while he was practicing as a corporate attorney. So Tony, you're a recovering attorney turned watch guy.
That's right. So first of all, thanks for having me on, Andy. But yeah, that's completely right. I've been doing it full time for almost going on 2 years now. And I have to say, I'm a writer, a photographer by day, but your intro was as poetic as anything I've written about watches and why they continue to be attractive to us, even though they're a total anachronism. So I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on, man.
Well, welcome, guys. Just a quick mention that we're hoping that Katie Cassidy, Arrowverse actress, will be able to join us today. Unfortunately, Jassim Al-Zarai, also known as Patekaholic, who is in Kuwait, is unable to join us because he had a death in his family. So we send our sincere condolences to Jassim and his family. And unfortunately, he won't be here. But I'm excited to have Christian and Tony in the house. Hopefully, Katie will be coming in soon. Let's go straight into segment 1.
A tourbillon counteracts gravity's effect on a watch's accuracy, introduced by Abraham Louis Breguet in the 1800s. This mechanism features a rotating cage that moves the escapement and balance wheel through all vertical positions, thus averaging out errors caused by gravity. Designs now range from single to triple axis variants, enhancing timekeeping precision. Perpetual calendars showcase mechanical ingenuity, automatically adjusting for month lengths and leap years, negating the need for manual setting. This system, through intricate gearing, accurately displays the date indefinitely under a Gregorian schedule, exemplifying seamless integration of complex functions. Minute repeaters offer an audible time indication through a sophisticated system that chimes hours, quarters, and minutes. They combine over 500 parts to produce distinct tones, highlighting the intricate craftsmanship required to meld mechanical and acoustic engineering. These features embody the legacy and craftsmanship of elite watchmaking, prized by collectors for their technical and artistic merit.
So if Christian can kick us off, are you into complications? And in what ways do complications like minute repeaters and perpetual calendars reflect this intersection of technology and art?
Yeah, complications are awe-inspiring, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. When you look at the minute repeater or you look at the tourbillon, two fantastic examples. Not to leave the GMT or the chronograph in the dust, because they're also brilliant, and they're also brilliant. The complication really just represents, which is very poetic, but technically brilliant, the far reaches of the human genius, right? I mean, what are human beings capable of in such small confines, right, within the parameters of a watch case, right? So as a mental exercise, it's amazing. As an onlooker, it's a technical science that I'm amazed by. That being said, complications are very largely, useless, right? They're obsolete in many ways, right? We don't, Steve McQueen needed a chronograph, sure, but most of my friends with chronographs maybe time what's on the grill, right? I mean, there's not really that much application in everyday use. The Milgauss by Rolex, again, the complication, right? The protection of a mechanism from magnetic fields, brilliant, a fantastic evolution of technology. Today, most scientists that I know that are in rooms with X-rays aren't wearing a wristwatch, maybe, and if there is one, it's an Apple Watch, right? So many of these evolutions have become obsolete. That being said, their existence is a love letter, right, to human genius. So for that reason, I always applaud brands' development of new technology, even if there's no application, civilian or military, right? It's just, wow, I can't believe Bulgari was able to do that. I can't believe the brilliance of Piaget, etc. Right? That's how I look at it.
Are you wearing a watch today?
I am an uncomplicated watch. This is a Cartier Santos Carré. It's a beautiful watch. It's definitely it's definitely evidence of the brilliance of design, right? But as so far as complication, no. It's a very simple timepiece, certainly.
How about you, Tony?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I am wearing a watch. I don't know if that's exactly what you were asking, but I'll answer the complication question by starting with the watch I brought on vacation, as you mentioned. It's just a simple Seiko 5. I guess it does tell the day and date, but if you look at it, you'll notice that it's off. I've got to set it. So I guess One joke that people say is, you know, a watch guy by whether or not they set the date. Because, you know, if you go to a watch meetup and there's guys wearing watches with dates, they are very rarely set correctly, because they're wearing a different watch every day. They're not practical, you know, if you're lucky the time is set correctly. But there's kind of this joke that the journey of a watch collector begins with, or a watch enthusiast kind of begins with, a simple time only watch, kind of a Cartier tank or a Santos like Christian's wearing, even a simple Seiko 5 like I just showed you, or a Rolex Submariner or something like that might tell the date but tells the time, and that's about it. Eventually you discover the lovely world of complications, tourbillons, chronographs, whatever it is, and you realize how awe-inspiring they are and how amazing it is that, you know, mechanics and modern day machinery and craftsmen and all these types of things can build a tourbillon or a chronograph or a split seconds chronograph or whatever it might be. And then, you know, somewhere along the way, you kind of say, yeah, those chronographs are cool, but all I really need is a simple, again, Cartier tank or Patek Calatrava or whatever it might be. So this is kind of the classic journey of the watch collector. You kind of go through it. It's more of a cycle than like a linear journey, I would say. You kind of go through it, you know, depending on how sick you are in the head, every couple of months, every couple of years. Chronographs is probably my favorite complication, as it were. It's classic. The Steve McQueens, the Paul Newmans, you find these old vintage photos of them wearing amazing watches like these from Rolex, Hoyer, whatever they are. And the modern iterations often are quite cool as well, even if you're not timing racetracks, you're timing something super boring. But that's kind of the most awe-inspiring to me, or however you want to put it. But at the end of the day, like Christian, I'm a simple guy. I'm wearing a Seiko 5 here on vacation. I haven't found myself wanting a tourbillon from FP Journe or Breguet or all those other beautiful photos that you kind of shared at the beginning. Though they certainly serve a place in the watchmaking world, and they will continue to, because, like, as I'm sure we'll get into, you know, this is where watchmaking continues to sort of serve a purpose in the world. And, you know, a lot of the watchmakers or brands that are coming up with these complications and building on complications that date back to the 1600s. It's like the way in which you push watchmaking forward and continue to make it an interesting space for people to discover.
Well, I should take the opportunity to thank Hodinkee for the watch images and some of the video there. Christian, you're a historian and a thought leader, but I've also heard you express regret after buying a $24,000 watch. Like, how does a watch make you feel? And I'm assuming that the more complicated, like the more complications, the more expensive, right?
Oftentimes there are certainly exceptions there, right? There are extremely expensive time-only watches, and there are affordable complications, right? I mean, a big press or a big move in the watch industry by many brands. JLC has been one of them. Montblanc and so many brands have attempted to deliver complication more affordably, right? The democratization of complication has happened at the same time as other brands are seeing how far they can push, how well they can decorate, how well they can architect a time-only watch, right? We see this from Parmigiani recently. They've released an absolutely brilliant time-only watch at this year's Watches and Wonders, which is the premier watch fair where all the big brands release their watches. You know, you have a $50,000 watch that just tells you the time, and then you've got a $13,000 watch that accounts for the leap year, right? So there are brands constantly trying to fill, right, that white space, right, move like water and fill the gaps, period. So it's interesting to see how the brands move and operate and what they think the future is of the industry. And the answer is, in many ways, it's everything all at once, right? I mean, there are emerging spaces, of course, but, the spaces that have always worked still continue to, right? I mean, the desire for, Patek Philippe sort of grandpa style perpetual calendars, maybe 10 years ago when certain folks Tony's here. So when Ben Clymer of Hodinkee had his Patek Philippe perpetual calendar 3940 in yellow gold all those years ago, or white gold maybe, all those years ago, it wasn't as cool. Today, those watches have doubled, almost tripled in value, and to wear one makes you, kind of a leader in the space. And he was right back then, right? It's just that the world has caught up now, and folks are now appreciating or reappreciating, classic watchmaking. At the same time as Richard Mille is developing things that are, the exact opposite, right? So there are so many truths all being held at once.
Yeah, I'm curious, Tony, what trends you see?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big trends people have been talking about the past few years is just a trend towards smaller, dressier watches. Some of this is probably a little bit overstated, but this is kind of the general narrative that people have been talking about. But if you zoom out broader than that, like Ben, ostensibly my boss at Hodinkee, or the founder of the website that I now work for, or the company that I now work for, he will tell the story of when he got into watches in 2008 when he founded Hodinkee. The view of Swiss watch luxury was big, complicated watches, these triple X, these tourbillons from brands like JLC or whoever else that you kind of alluded to there a little bit. These were big watches, complicated watches, expensive watches, most importantly. And guys like Ben and others came onto the scene, and they said, no, you know what's really cool is like Steve McQueen wearing this simple steel Rolex, or Paul Newman wearing a simple steel Daytona, and recognizing that these simple steel, sometimes vintage watches, but sometimes not, were what was really cool and core to the brand. And then at some point that became the ongoing narrative. And we saw an explosion in interest in these once kind of forgotten or even thought of as nerdy watches from Patek and Audemars Piguet, the Nautiluses, the Royal Oaks, the Rolex Daytonas of the world became like the quote unquote hype watches. And that kind of culminated in this huge run up in the pandemic where these watches were selling for multiple times retail at the apex of the market before it all kind of came crumbling down. And these watches were, for the most part, not complicated. And that's kind of changed in the past year or so as the market has slowed down for those. People have, as Christian said, become more interested again in traditional watchmaking. Sometimes that means complicated watchmaking, but not always. Christian mentioned the Patek perpetual calendar from the 80s and 90s, the 3940. This is a perpetual calendar, sure, but it's also like very traditional and classic in a way. It wears small and slim on the wrist, and it's not the same as those fancy JLC gyro tourbillons I mentioned at the top that were the rage of the Swiss watch industry in 2008. It's complicated watchmaking, but it's quite traditional in its aesthetic, and I kind of like where we've landed for now. Obviously, trends go back and forth, so you know, we'll only be here for some time before something new catches on, I'm sure. But I kind of like where we're at right now, where there's this huge emphasis in classic style, traditional watchmaking, and complications without being totally ostentatious about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like there's something for everybody, and it's always evolving. Any last comments before we move on?
No, I agree with Tony completely. I mean, seeing young men and women gravitate yet again toward, really, I'll use the word mature, right? Mature watchmaking, things that were for older men, right? Kind of almost geriatric, not so long ago. It's nice, right? I'm glad when I see a 29-year-old that maybe 10 years ago would have had something on that was a little bit more, it was larger and more complicated and younger, now saying, wow, I'm really interested in a vintage Longines, right? That's a really good thing so far as I see it. So that's just my personal opinion.
Thank you for that. Let's move on with segment 2.
Evaluating limited edition watches and special collaborations are essential for collectors, highlighting their investment potential and exclusive allure. These pieces are often produced in finite numbers and boast distinctive, sometimes bespoke design features resulting from partnerships beyond conventional watchmaking, like ties with automotive brands or renowned artists. The Omega Speedmaster Professional Alaska Project watch, designed for extreme conditions, exemplifies the collectible nature of limited editions. This model merges technical resilience with historical narrative, boosting its collectability. Similarly, the Unimatic Modello Uno U1 HGMT for Hodinkee reflects a jet-set spirit with its 24-hour graduated bezel and second time zone hand, enhancing its appeal and market value through functional innovation and sleek design. Beyond telling time, such watches encapsulate unique moments in history or cultural phenomena. They can appreciate and value, propelled by their rarity and the stories they embody, making them more than mere accessories, but pieces of our cultural tradition. Collectors seek and appreciate these watches not only for their functionality, but for their emblematic and artistic significance.
So Tony, we saw that collaboration with Hodinkee there. What are the key elements that define the success of a limited edition watch in today's market?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say thanks for including that, Andy. That was not a paid promotion in any way. Andy did that on his own account, presumably because he loves the watch and thinks it's beautiful and loves the collaboration between Hodinkee and Unimatic. So we appreciate it, Andy. But, you know, I think the thing that makes a good collaboration, collaborations are kind of the rage in the watch industry and more broadly fashion, style, streetwear, whatever. Watches in many ways are kind of late to the game and recognizing the potential of collaborations and limited editions and all of these types of things. The thing I always say about collaborations and limited editions that make them successful to me, or in my eyes, is when a collaborator, whether it's a publication like Hodinkee or another outside brand, is able to work with a watch brand, a watch manufacturer, and bring something out of the brand that was always there, either in their heritage or in their watchmaking or in the way in which they see the world or their perspective on the world, but that the brand would have never recognized or drawn on if left to its own devices, if that makes sense. So to use that Hodinkee GMT limited edition as just an example, right? I think just the cool sort of monotone vibe. Look, this is what Hodinkee does with a lot of our limited editions. We have this cool monotone vibe, and it really works with just the Unimatic aesthetic. They've got these minimal dive watches that play on a lot of these vintage Blancpain 50 Fathoms, Rolex Submariners, all these types of vintage dive watches that so many folks love. And Hodinkee just puts like a little bit of a new twist on it, right? Because of the way our designers see the Unimatic sort of design language and the things that they've done over the years. So I think, to me, that's like how a good limited edition or a good collaboration can function. And you know, there are a lot that have been successful. I mean, as we record, right, there was a Tag Heuer Formula One Kith limited edition that dropped this morning that, you know, as mentioned, I've been on vacation, so I haven't been on social media, but I'm sure everyone's got a great opinion on it. But I think that's like great. You know, from my perspective, like one of the things that's great about these is they continue, whether or not people like them, they continue to sort of drive dialogue and discourse for better and worse in the community, which is, you know what, as long as it's all in good fun at the end of the day, it's fine by me.
Christian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Hodinkee is such a fantastic example of you know, successful collaboration, right? Successful collaboration. You know, the bar is high in the watch industry for successful collaboration, right? And I think that most collaborations fall short of that bar. I think a great example that I use a lot, and I feel bad because I do love Bulgari. Years ago, Bulgari just put a Maserati Trident in the center of their watch and called it a collab. I couldn't disagree more. It's actually ironic because, you know, one of the folks that has spoken out so passionately against kind of illogical collaboration is the owner of Maserati, well, the grandson, Lapo Elkan, is an Italian entrepreneur who has his own faults, but he's really spoken so eloquently on what a successful collaboration looks like, right? The meeting of two brands, not the co-branding, but the meeting of two, right? And I happen to think that Bulgari Maserati missed, but Hodinkee has done a fantastic job, be it with Resins, be it with Gronfeld, be it with Oris. Another brilliant modern example was Rolex's James Cameron. Right, in 2012, Rolex equipped James Cameron on his, I guess, Challenger Deep. He didn't even wear the watch. The watch actually went on one of the pieces of machinery and went all the way down to the Marianas Trench. That's amazing. That is an amazing collaboration, right? James Cameron is not just a Rolex spokesman, but I mean, geez, he is such a passionate Rolex owner. The conviction with which he's represented Rolex over the last few decades has been amazing. So to see that watch come about is in many ways a modern day Alaska project. And by the way, fantastic pull there from history. That's a great example. So, I guess because there are so many, I think, mediocre collaborations, when you've got a really brilliant one, like some of those collabs from Hodinkee, like the James Cameron, it's special. It's just a really special moment to celebrate, even though you can't really usually get one because they're limited, right? I mean, not the Rolex, but that one was mass produced. But anyway, it's nice to see brilliance, right? I was going to say incarnate, but watches aren't made of meat, so you know what I mean.
Well, Christian, you're very much an entrepreneur. So a lot of the time on paper, the collaboration is like, oh, well, we're going to get in front of your audience and then our audience, and they can cross-pollinate, and there's a market opportunity there. But I hear both of you guys talking about ideally it's more than that. It's about the design, the creativity. There's something unique about bringing two entities or two companies together to do something special. Tony, any favorites in your book?
Thanks. Yeah. You know, I think people honestly see through that a lot nowadays when it's, hey, you have an audience over there, we have an audience over here. Why don't we leverage each other to meet each other's audience, to find each other's audience and hopefully sell them stuff? I think people see through that for the most part nowadays, not only in watches, but more broadly, right? So you have to bring something more to the table, design wise, or whether it's in, you know, the calibers or the movements inside. I think people want to see something more that like makes sense in bringing these 2 or 3 or however many companies it is that are coming together to do a collaboration. There's so many great ones. You know, listen, the biggest one of the past few years is Omega Swatch. I don't know if this even technically counts as a collab because they're both owned by the Swatch Group, kind of a large conglomerate that owns a bunch of brands, right? But this is the one that kind of set the world on fire a few years ago and continues to drive a lot of discussion, honestly, whether or not people like it. Now they're releasing ones with Snoopy on the dial. There's a long connection with Snoopy and the Omega MoonWatch. And I know you've talked about the MoonWatch on your other watch podcast, so I won't go too much into depth in the history of the Omega MoonWatch. But honestly, like bringing a watch like that to the masses for $270 or whatever it is, price wise, it's very accessible. I think that's great, and that it uses the ethos of Swatch and the design and the heritage and history of Omega and the MoonWatch to do something that's great. You know, where they fumbled it a little bit is in the release and the accessibility of the release and it not being online and you having to stand in line for it and kind of perpetuating this hype culture and all of these types of things that are kind of some of the less savory aspects of streetwear and sneakers and whatever else. But, you know, they kind of nailed it in idea, at least, and kind of making the MoonWatch an accessible thing because not everyone's going to spend $6,000 or whatever it is for an Omega MoonWatch, right? So being able to do that and buy into that heritage for a couple hundred is like a realization of a great idea of a collaboration in my eyes.
Christian, do you own it?
I completely agree with you, Tony. I think that the MoonSwatch was great. I mean, and I think, you know, anyone walking through any major city is just as likely to see a MoonSwatch on the wrist of a collector with a collection of great value as they are with someone that you know, couldn't have otherwise or wouldn't have otherwise purchased a MoonWatch, right? I mean, the MoonSwatch has really you know, brought these two groups of people together and kind of allowed them to break bread, right, over the piece. I like it. I also agree with Tony that the release plan has been a little bit messed up, right? I think originally there was a problem, and then later on, you know, just the sheer amount of limited editions and the lack of differentiation between them, really, I think just bored people. I still do believe it's a massive retail success. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars to the brand, so God bless them. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of that. Like, I couldn't have said it better than Tony, right? The ethos meeting with that heritage and design. Couldn't have said it better.
Do either of you have any thoughts on, just because both of you mentioned accessibility as being, you know, an issue for collectors, for consumers? And I hear stories where somebody is collecting Pateks and then they just can't get them. Like, they might have a stretch where they're buying a bunch and they're like, oh, I have access, but then they don't buy for a little while and they lose access. And then they say, oh, well, in the meantime, I'm able to buy Rolexes. And then it kind of like they steered towards a Rolex. Whether it's limited edition or just the way the industry works. Any comments on, like, I don't know, as an outsider, sometimes I feel like I understand scarcity and how that's good for business. But then the you know, the skeptic in me says, well, is it just like a false? Is it just like a controlled scarcity?
Yeah, I mean, I think even honestly, the idea that you think it might be sort of this artificial scarcity is proof that the brands have, whether or not intentionally, gone too far in the direction of scarcity and it being inaccessible to buy, whether it's your first, fifth, or 10th Patek. I mean, we've heard complaints on Hodinkee's website in the comments over the past few years, especially as watches have exploded in value, of how it's difficult to buy someone wants to buy their first Rolex Submariner or Patek Calatrava. These are the watches that you used to be able to buy after you'd had a great year in whatever profession you were, high level profession, of course. But if you had a great year, you're supposed to be able to walk into a retailer and do it. And, look, the fundamental push and pull of luxury is the inaccessibility of it, and having to save up for it and all of these things, and having something that other people don't have, and that type of thing. But I think just the rise in popularity in watches, especially over the COVID bump, caught a lot of people at watch brands and manufacturers a little bit off guard. And brands were rightfully so a little bit reluctant to just pick up production for its own sake, knowing that, the music stops eventually and the good times sort of don't run forever. And we've seen that over the past 18 months or whatever, as the market has slowed down significantly. So I think the long term will kind of prove the strategy out that brands had in not increasing production too much to meet this temporary bump in demand. But the fact that this perceived inaccessibility that you even mentioned has turned a lot of people off from the industry is a huge bummer for me as someone who loves watches, because the reality of the situation is there are a lot of great ways to kind of waste or blow money. I'm not going to say waste money, but there are a lot of ways to buy expensive things, right? You can get into cars or wine or whatever it is. There are a lot of ways to have fun in this world. And if watches aren't there and accessible for people that want to buy them and have the money to spend on them, then they're going to go find something else to enjoy their time and their money with. So maybe we've missed the mark on some level, but I think supply and demand is balancing out a little bit now.
Agreed with Tony again. I think that I try to be an advocate for a well-balanced life, and I think that generally speaking, people do fixate and they have trouble having a balanced life, and I even mean balance with with your luxury superfluous expenses, right? I mean, I think that if you're spending all of your disposable income on watches, and yet you don't. You wince when you go out to dinner with the wife or with your buddies. I think you're missing the point. I think if you've got a Patek on, I expect you to get a better bottle of wine than the $21 bottle and to bring over and crack open on a Thursday night or a Friday night. So I think that folks do miss, right? And it's the answer, the defensive answer is, well, I'm not into wine. Okay, but have you tried the other beautiful things that are out there in the world? I think that a lot of it is that watches are in this really interesting place where you get a lot of value out of a watch. A bottle of wine or a wine hobby or habit is very fleeting, right? You have it and then it's gone, right? Whereas a watch is this, in many cases, asset. It's a liability, I suppose, but a lot of times the values are relatively speaking, predictably stable, right? So folks can justify it that way. I also think, and I don't have research on this, but just anecdotally, I think we've all witnessed a big change in what the middle class and the upper middle class is willing to kind of portion out of their income for these luxury expenses. Again, I don't know exactly, but going back 15, 20 years, I don't think that you would have found the same percentile, composing this luxury class or this luxury consumer profile, right? I think that there are a lot more people of a lot lesser income now, even high income, but just not as high as it once was, really buying those watches. I mean, when I was a kid, you didn't see a Rolex date on the wrist of 30 people at a restaurant. You just didn't, right? That was a very special, somewhat, unusual, thing. And that watch was always, one of the first things you went and bought if you were going to go spend a lot of money on a watch, right? I mean, that was standard issue in many ways. And now it's depending on where you live, of course, but you go to Staten Island or you go to the Upper West Side and everyone there, everyone has a considerably expensive wristwatch. And I think that's pretty abnormal, right? Not to mention Loro Piana shoes and a Range Rover. And I don't just think that is to be credited towards a rise in income. I do think it's to be credited to a change in culture and our priorities.
Yeah, that's a great point. Unfortunately, we've seen credit card debt continue to rise, and extra complex after the pandemic, because we saw people really interested in goods and then a shift towards experiences, and there are just so many moving parts. So thank you for that. Let's move to segment 3.
The impact of brand heritage on valuation is profound. Brands like Rolex and Patek Philippe, which boast rich histories, not only sustain value, but often see appreciation over time due to their emblematic status and historical significance. Collectors value these brands for their consistent ability to combine tradition with innovative watchmaking. Rolex, for example, is celebrated for its enduring designs and significant historical milestones, such as Sir Edmund Hillary's Mount Everest expedition. This storied past enriches their watch's narrative, enhancing collector interest and market value. Patek Philippe highlights a legacy of complex mechanisms and exclusivity, with masterpieces featuring complications like perpetual calendars and minute repeaters. Their commitment to craftsmanship fosters a strong market demand, further increasing their watch's worth. Overall, a brand's heritage shapes its identity and desirability in the market. Watches from houses with a celebrated past and a reputation for quality and rarity can be treasured assets, coveted for their historical and aesthetic value.
Christian, since you've had experience running a vintage watch shop, how does brand heritage influence your own watch collection?
Oh, geez. There is almost no way to justify with logic the delta between the logical argument for a purchase and its value and your affinity, right? Your affinity is that delta is made up of stories we tell ourselves, connections that we form to kind of justify these things, right? Why do I have such an affinity for Cartier, right? I can tell myself stories about my dad being in college at Stony Brook and being the poor kid that wasn't able to afford Cartier, and all his friends had sent us carrés. That's why I picked up the gauntlet and bought myself a carré when I was. It's all stories. It's just stories, and these brands are able to, if they are self-aware and they know the stories that their clients tell themselves, they're able to continue telling those stories. Patek Philippe has done a fantastic job, right? Patek Philippe is, if there's a single watch brand that sells something that is completely luxurious and eternal, it is Patek Philippe, right? Rolex watches are just as eternal, right? They're going to last just as long, probably even longer, but they're not quite as luxurious, right? A Patek Philippe is very similar to the way that Tony described before, the kind of the complication, affinity and the journey that folks have. A lot of people buy a lot of things. They have a Patek and they buy a million other things and they end up back at Patek, right? Because nothing does that job as well. Patek knows that, so Panerai is another great brand, right? It's a brand that, made a lot of its fame off of hyper or machismo through Arnold Schwarzenegger, and now has evolved, but telling that same story, but now through the Navy SEALs, right? I mean, they just know this is our story. This is our bread and butter. Let's not deviate from it too far. And let's keep selling everyone on this dream. And we buy it, we buy it.
It sounds like you guys are both Cartier fans, because Tony, don't you like Cartier? You and your dad?
Oh, my dad doesn't care about watches.
Smart man.
Yeah, smart man. I got him a tank. He had always said he wanted one when he retired a couple of years ago, and the truth is he never wore it, and I got rid of it soon after. He's just fine with his Seiko 5, honestly, if not an Apple Watch or whatever. So you try. But no, I do love Cartier. I got into it, honestly, probably a little bit from watching Christian's videos back in the days. Christian was a harbinger of so many things, of so many tastes, and the way in which the watch world has changed over the years. But honestly, a lot of these watches were, I'm a little bit of a smaller guy, smaller wrist. Cartier makes these smaller watches that always fit my aesthetic. Just wanted something that fits nice and slim and close to the wrist and all these types of things. But yeah, I mean, it's all stories, right? And I think at the end of the day, you can also find watches that are very similar to Pateks, vintage Pateks that use similar suppliers, similar dial makers, even similar movements. But we attach the story especially to the name on the dial, and that is, in large part the justification for all of this craziness. It's all stories, like Christian said. And I think, for me, there are a few real kind of blue chip watchmakers. We talk about trends and things that come and go, and I think we've mentioned most of them at this point, honestly. Patek and Rolex and Cartier. I hesitate to use the word blue chip because then it sounds like an investment, which is not, you know, how I want to portray watches in any way. But these are the watches that, you know, since wristwatches at least have been considered quote unquote collectible for the past 30 or 40 years or however long it's been now. These are the vintage watches, especially, that are considered collectible, and every auction season in Geneva or New York or wherever, you're going to see them and they're going to do well, and people are going to go crazy for the good ones at least. So those are the ones that have sort of the brand heritage, especially, that I think withstand the test of time and trends and everything else. And people tend to latch on to their stories, especially because they have the staying power across generations at this point, honestly. I mean, Christian talked about his dad and all of that type of stuff, and it can take generations for this type of heritage to be built up.
Yeah, Christian, I'm just curious about the story aspect, because like the historical milestone with Rolex's involvement in the Everest expedition, I mean, that does enhance the value and appeal of the brand, right? You're very focused on story at LMF, and coming up with like a story, a campaign. Give us some insight on that from, like, you know, for watch consumers, for watch brands, etc.
Yeah, I think that Tony and I have both discussed this, you know, publicly, that, you know, the Everest story, there was another brand there as well, it was Smiths. You know, so Rolex and Smiths both have an equal claim to this story of Everest, right? Tenzing Norgay and oh geez, I only remember the Sherpa's name. That's good. Tenzing Norgay, there you go. And Sir Edmund Hillary. Wow,
Hillary.
That's the first time that's ever happened. That's hysterical.
Kudos to the Sherpas.
And kudos to Rolex, because they understood that this is a fantastic opportunity. Technically, we have a competitor that could also seize this story, which would really, you know, kind of water the whole thing down, right? If two folks are competing to be the champion of Everest, that doesn't really look very good, you know. But Rolex won, you know. Rolex won then, and Rolex has continued to win over the past, God knows how many decades, over 100 years, right? And you know, right back to, you know, the 1920s, I believe, with the oyster case as well. I mean, Rolex is just, it's a marketing machine. I mean, Rolex is a marketing machine, period. They understand it. Cartier, right? Cartier, I'm very critical of all these watch companies' ads, right? And I think a lot of them are really, really bad, right? Cartier recently released, or last year released, an advertisement, a whole campaign with Rami Malek. I think from beginning to end, it was a bad campaign. I mean, everything they released, every piece of derivative content, I think, was bad, right? And yet, a year before, Cartier released an absolutely brilliant campaign of these two, you know, boyfriend, girlfriend, you know, traveling on the road, and it was absolutely brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. If you watch that campaign after a couple of scotches, especially on a Thursday night, I mean, you're gonna cry. You're gonna cry, because Cartier is, more than any other brand, love. Right? Patek Philippe does not represent love in any, you know, it doesn't hold a candle to the way that Cartier represents love, right? They have the love bracelet as well, but, you know, they've allowed this love bracelet to kind of inform their entire brand identity, right? From the bracelet itself to all their other, right, collections, the engagement, everything. Cartier represents love, and I think that the tank does it so well as well. And, you know, all these different brands have their separate places, you know, and again, it's just a matter of having really smart creative at the helm, and that's not always the case, right? It's certainly not always the case, but the brands so far, all in all, right, from a bird's eye view, zooming out over the last century, have done incredibly well. You know, one little thing before we move on, you know, you look back at Cartier and look at how much they've pivoted, right? You look at the Tank Normal. The Tank Normal is like the original tank. The original Cartier tank was a reaction to war, right? The reaction to the tracks of the Renault tanks of the First World War. Very much, you know, like 60s Vietnam protest war song, right? It's art created from war. And yet they've transitioned that now to a love song, right, to the most beautiful ballad, the most beautiful love letter to your wife or to your husband. I think more to wife. But anyway, I'm a sucker for this stuff. That's why I spend so much money on it, right? I do the marketing campaigns, God knows, but I didn't own a Breguet until we did a marketing thing with Breguet, and then I bought one. I was like, wow, I just
Sure.
spent all the money I just made. There you go. Like, that was stupid, but you fall so deeply and hopelessly in love with the brand, and we're just a bunch of suckers. I know I'm definitely a sucker. So
Well, when the commercial tugs on our heartstrings and it's a love story, then we're all toast. So let's move on to segment 4.
In the world of watch collecting, mastering authentication and condition assessment are crucial. This process involves meticulous inspections using specialized tools such as magnifiers and calipers to verify a watch's authenticity and examine its components for signs of wear or modifications. Advanced techniques like X-ray fluorescence and scanning electron microscopy are employed to assess the material integrity and detect replacement parts, ensuring the watch is as close to its original specification as possible. Condition assessment also includes evaluating the watch's mechanical functionality and overall wear, which is essential for maintaining its value. Provenance verification is another crucial step, involving the examination of serial numbers, documentation, and service records to confirm the watch's history and legality. These methods provide a comprehensive understanding of a watch's authenticity and condition, essential for collectors in the secondary market to protect their investments and ensure the value of their collections.
Well, first things first, thank you to Christian for the LMF NYC edit on this segment and our final segment. Turned this into like a cinematic experience. So thank you for that. I mentioned at the start that I have this love-hate relationship with technology, and I've since read articles about how watches can be, there can be fake watches made just from like a 3D printer. So it's getting cheaper, and I think that the fakes are getting more sophisticated. Tony, can you kick us off? Like, what are the most effective methods for ensuring the authenticity of a luxury watch?
Yeah, honestly, it's a scary world out there. I'll see these YouTube videos, Instagram posts, whatever, of these so-called super fakes of a Rolex or whatever it is that I would never know or not, or held side by side a real authenticated new watch look exactly the same. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is sort of, especially in the vintage and auction world, things get put together all the time. The authenticity of things is always like one of the big questions that adds to the value of the watch. And especially in recent years, I think when watch collecting was starting out in the 80s and 90s, people primarily wanted a watch that just looked good. They didn't really care if they were putting together a dial and a case or whatever. They just wanted a watch that looked cool, honestly. And that's changed. Nowadays, vintage collectors especially, they value originality and rarity, or excuse me, they value originality and condition. They want a watch that came out of the Rolex factory in the 1960s as it is presented to them today, or Patek, same situation. And I have a friend who says condition is the new rarity. Basically, I think today's collector has come to value this type of originality and condition. When I mean condition, I mean not only all original, but also cases that are maintain sharp and original lines and dials that have not been messed with, and maintain originality and don't have replace loom plots and all of these types of things. There are all types of little things that, especially when you get into the vintage side of things, become really scary quite quickly. There's a common saying you'll hear that's buy the seller, but if you don't know what seller to even work with, that doesn't really mean much. So I'm wary to even give that advice. I have a friend that gives advice that's buy what you know, basically. And I think the internet has made it a lot easier to sort of aggregate information from a variety of sources, Hodinkee, Theo, and Harris videos, whatever it is. And I think you have to do your own research and learn a lot about what you might be buying, whether it's new, whether it's an independent watchmaker, whether it's a vintage Rolex or Patek or Cartier or whatever it is we've been talking about. You need to really know what you're buying before you even reach out to a seller and figure out who a good seller or dealer or auction house might be to buy from, because buy the seller only gets you so far, is the honest truth. Even some of these auction houses that are large names and watches and art and everything else have found themselves in hot water at times because of things that have appeared at their sales. So that's sort of my overarching advice, is kind of buy what you know, and it takes a while to sort of buy what you know. So you kind of have to start slowly.
Again, couldn't possibly agree with Tony more. You know, buy the seller has always historically been great advice, but you know, I don't know. I don't. You know, I've been in this game for 9 years, and you know, all dealers do is talk about other dealers and what they've done, and so you know, almost everyone's hand is dirty on the high. I'm talking about the high end, really specifically. You know, actually, the you know, more moderate end of watches on the vintage end, you know, let's say under $50,000 is actually a safer zone to be in than getting into the really expensive stuff. That's where there's so much to gain, right? You know, felonious actors have so much to gain, and people, you know, people don't want to be people, you know, in their omission end up, you know, complicit, right? They end up, you know, they end up in it, right? It's a disaster, you know, and I've called it out a couple of times, and even then, you know, there are plenty of times I haven't as well, right? Because you don't want to make enemies and everything. You know, you don't want to end up blacklisted, right? If you talk too much smack. You know, listen, if your budget is that large, if you're spending really big money, hundreds of thousands of dollars on wristwatches, the best, you know, advice I could possibly give would be to basically assemble, you know, what in medicine you would call like a tumor board, right? I mean, a group of experts that are all maybe separate, you know, and getting multiple opinions, then maybe encouraging conversation. You're paying by the hour. This will not be cheap, but that is far safer, I think, than just trusting the word of a dealer. Every dealer that we know, or almost every dealer that we know in those high end, you know, hundreds of thousands, has committed crimes. I mean, they've committed crimes. You know, I work for a much smaller company than Tony, so I can be a little bit, you know, be a little bit more, right? But it's the truth. They've committed crimes, and that's it. You know, for various reasons, and it's, you know, for various reasons. So, but you know, back to a more positive note. Tony's absolutely right that a lot of this did start from a more innocent place, right? You know, there are felonious actors, sure, but there are also situations where, or many situations, a culture maybe, where our expectation of originality is maybe unfair and uninformed, right? I mean, there is nothing wrong with a vintage Daytona with you know, with replacement hands. Nothing wrong with that, right? But because we've pumped originality so much into the culture, folks have forgotten what the larger context of watch collecting really looks like, right? And what a great watch is. A great watch can have replacement hands, so long as we all know what it is and the price reflects, right? A great watch can have a replacement dial. It's a, you know, if it's a genuine dial and the price reflects it and there's transparency, nothing wrong with that, right? We're making informed decisions. It's when the water gets muddy that people do, you know, people are deceived and lose a lot of money, right? I think that's unobjectionable.
Yeah, the one thing I want to add real quickly, we're focusing on a lot of the sort of vintage and high-end market, especially in the modern and pre-owned market, brands are getting more involved in cleaning up the secondary market, especially where a lot of this happens. So Rolex, for example, probably 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, started its own certified pre-owned program. I'm seeing it rolled out in a lot more retailers across the States and Europe for now, at least. So if that's a large segment of the market, if we're being honest about it, Rolex and the pre-owned market specifically. So brands are getting more focused about cleaning this type of thing up. And if that's the market segment of the market you're looking at specifically, look for programs like that, where it's gone to a manufacturer and you can get sort of this, the Rolex stamp of approval in this case that says, yes, we took this watch, we serviced it, and here are all the things we did with it. And now you know it's going to run, or you've got a warranty for 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is. So the space is getting a little bit more welcoming and accessible for that swath of the market, at least.
Great point. Let's bring it home and go to the last segment.
Shifting from hobbyist to strategic investor, requires a deep understanding of market dynamics and investment principles to maximize returns. Understanding market timing is crucial. It involves buying watches at low prices and selling high, anticipating fluctuations based on brand milestones or shifts in demand. Diversification is another key strategy. By acquiring watches from various brands, eras, or styles, collectors can mitigate risks and stabilize potential returns. Strategic acquisition should focus on pieces with high appreciation potential, utilizing historical performance and market forecasts to guide purchases. Including watches as part of a broader financial strategy involves balancing high-risk, high-reward pieces with more stable, established models and spreading acquisitions over time to reduce impact from market volatility. By applying these investment principles, collectors can elevate their collection to a robust financial strategy, leveraging their passion for watches into a lucrative portfolio.
All right. Well, that was some watch porn right there. And Christian as the fashion model, very, very impressed.
A little indulgent, I'll admit. If I winced at least once.
It's all about the slow. It was the slow-mo. It was the slow-mo.
Someone's getting fired. No.
Christian, should collectors approach watches as investors? Let's start there.
I agree with Tony's trepidation before about, using too much investment language. In many ways, it is bad for the community because people who are passionate ultimately then have a hard time competing with the inflation, right? Because when everything is just an investment and everyone is divested emotionally, it becomes tough, right? The market becomes, a less beautiful place to be. That being said, to bury our heads in the sand and ignore certain patterns is also, willful ignorance, right? I mean, there are spaces in the market from, Patek Philippe and again, big blue chip, right? Patek Philippe, Rolex, Cartier, particularly Cartier in the last couple of years, that were, predictably on the rise, where we knew they were going to increase in value. And some of us rode that. Some of us rode that in larger ways than others as well. I invested in a Cartier crash before they were cool, and I made a couple of bucks, but not as much as everyone else did, right? I backed out a little early. I didn't have the sand to really hold my position. Won't make that mistake again. But it's really just a matter of temperament. How about this? It's very easy if you buy a watch and you truly don't care about it to look at it as an investment if it has an upward mobility, right? Because when you sell, when you liquidate, no one cares. It doesn't matter. If you fall in love with the watch, no one ever falls in love with their stocks, right? It's just like, okay, I made the money, we can all move on. People fall in love with watches every day, and then you don't want to sell it, and that's it, right? I mean, and that's what happens, right? This Cartier Carré is a great example. I paid something like $11,000 for it a couple of years ago, and it's probably worth around 30. I can't sell this watch. I love it too much. It was a great investment, but I love it too much, right? So it wasn't an investment. It was a loss from day one, right? Took the loss from day one. I just bought a nice thing, So listen, 1,000 ways to justify things. Some are logical, some are emotional, but you gotta write your own plan, I suppose, right, for your own temperament.
Tony, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I basically agree with that. I don't like calling them investments nor using that language necessarily. I think a lot of the unhealthiness in the market we saw during the COVID years of 2020 to 2022 were people chasing it or trying to make a quick buck because they thought it was an investment, though those were people that were in large part like flipping watches to make $100 or $1,000 really quickly. That said, I'm like totally aware of the fact that we spend a lot of money on these things and more every day. And I think at their best, watches can be a decent store of value. That said, like you need to be comfortable with losing in this case of that Santos, for example, losing the $11,000 or at least never seeing it again, right? Maybe because you love the watch too much and you don't want to sell it, or maybe because it does go down to, well, that watch is a lot of gold, so maybe it goes down to its gold value, I suppose. But being comfortable with at least never seeing it, there are probably better stores of value than watches. They're not a terrible store of value. And at the end of the day, you develop a relationship with this thing and you get to wear it and all that type of stuff. So like I said, trepidation with using the word investment in that type of language. But at the end of the day, like there are, it's a lot of money that's being put at stake. And I think I am cognizant of that and cognizant of the way that people do think about it like that. And that's kind of why I think so much of the focus of this discussion, I suppose, and just my focus generally often is like on these blue chip watches, the Pateks and the Rolex and the Cartier and these brands that have been around for centuries in some cases, I suppose. And those are the watches that are sort of more likely to be better stores of value. So focus your collecting or your efforts there at first. And then once you've established that foundation of your collection, you can sort of have more fun with other stuff. Watches that maybe they're independent watchmakers that you're taking a bet on, and you might totally lose your shirt in those. And I think sort of that's the money that you're really, really okay with completely losing. Taking a bet or showing some patronage for a new independent watchmaker or a new brand or whatever it is, because you believe in them and what they do. But that's the sort of fun segment of watch collecting after you've established the foundation of whatever it is that you like in those sort of quote unquote blue chip areas.
Yeah, on this podcast, I've heard from wine collectors speaking similarly. It's like many do not advise looking at their wine as an investment. It's like, buy what you like to drink. If it goes up and it appreciates, that's a bonus. Or you buy a case and you drink part of it and you say, all right, it went up in value. I can sell part of it to fund what I drank, which is interesting. Tony, your thoughts on like, I get a little concerned with that segment, just mixing the language, like investment language with the watches. And it did say like, I guess my question is, have you ever looked at a watch that you were interested in? Does it come into play that you're thinking about, is this a watch that can appreciate a lot?
You know, sometimes, look, I'm not a dealer like Christian, but I keep my eye on the market and small auction houses and these types of things. And sometimes I buy a watch knowing that I'm going to enjoy it for 6 months, but I found it at a small auction house and got a deal, and I'm going to sell it for what I believe the perceived market value is. But then you're taking you're taking a financial gamble. I think you have to know, as a collector, generally speaking, you have to know where you are on the, say, it's like the passion to investment scale, basically, right? Like any given watch that you buy might sit somewhere on that scale. And you just have to know full well what you're doing getting in. Like if I bought that watch thinking that it was an investment because I thought I got a deal at less than market value and I plan to sell it in 6 months or a year after I've enjoyed it for a little bit. And in the meantime, something happens. Like I at least went in eyes wide open, knowing that I thought it wasn't an investment and I really screwed up on that one. That said, most of the watches I buy are on the passion side of the scale. And in that case, it's money that I had already set aside for enjoyment, right? Maybe it was a watch, or maybe it could have been earmarked towards something else. Some of the other stuff that you've certainly covered on this podcast, or you can sort of hear people talk much more intelligently about than I, but just knowing that that's money that you might lose because it's something that feeds your passion, right? So I think you just kind of need to go in eyes wide open on any particular purchase, knowing what you're doing. And then like, as a collector, like why in general are you collecting? And then like, as long as you set your expectations with yourself, I suppose you can't really come away disappointed, because you kind of are being honest with yourself about what you're doing. If any of that makes sense, Andy.
That makes sense. Christian, any insights on the hunt, on finding that great deal, or closing thoughts?
Yeah, it's the great deal, and it's also the right watch, right? The more you read, the more you try on, the more you speak to people, the more you watch on YouTube, right? The better. I understand that we all have quick trigger fingers. I know that happens a lot in this space, but I really do encourage people to pause and to continue reading, continue researching. I think this is good advice when it comes to any decision making or anything before we have an opinion about anything. And we all ought to take a pause, right, more often. And that advice certainly applies in watches. I've seen so many folks buy a variant of something that they thought was correct, and they bought it quickly, rather than taking an extra week and finding out that another variant of equal cost would have suited them a lot better. I see it all the time, right? You see it with with Panerai is a great example, right? Not a brand that gets a lot of clout, but there are so many variations of this watch. So it's not a matter of, do I want a Cartier or do I want a Panerai, and then just buying it. It's, well, in their nuance, which fits me best, which will I be happiest with, be it for 6 months or for a lifetime, right? So everyone, take your time, right? Speak to folks like Tony, read blogs like Hodinkee, go on YouTube and just research and educate yourself. And then when the time is right, pour yourself a drink or a cup of coffee and celebrate the fact that you've made the right choice. That's so important, period.
Well, let's end it there. I want to thank everybody for joining this episode of Inspired Money. Thank you to both Tony and Christian for joining today. My apologies for a couple of panelists who are not able to make it. I think just some quick takeaways. I really appreciate the passion that both Christian and Tony have for watches. I mean, you can hear it in their voices. We heard many different watch brands, models mentioned in this episode. And I think sometimes that's contagious. So I love that these guys came on. I don't know how much I want to hang out with them because they could be a bad influence on my personal budget. I love that these guys are both knowledgeable and thoughtful about watches. I think that what we covered today is that it's okay to make purchases on luxury brands. And I love that Christian talked about finding balance in your life. You can't spend your entire budget on all watches. There are other things that you can enjoy in life, which sometimes is not expensive. It can just be a nice meal with your family that brings as much joy as like a rare Patek Philippe. So just be thoughtful in your purchases. Be careful out there, since there are fakes, and be sure to follow our panelists today. You can find Tony at tonytraina.com. That's TRAINA.com, or Hodinkee.com. Christian, you can find at lmfnyc.com. That's his marketing and creative agency, or his vintage shop, theoandharris.com. Great content. Shout out to both Hodinkee and Theo and Harris for sharing pictures of watches, which I think really made the segments more accurate and visually appealing. So thank you guys for joining. Thank you, the Inspired Moneymakers, for watching and listening. Be sure to join us next week, Wednesday, May 8th. Our topic is going to be the psychology of money. So we go from watches, the psychology of money, understanding your money mindset. Until next time, do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.